Well, as the saying goes, if the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And with Canada being one of the first in line, at least in terms of proximity, what does 11 days of fiscal shutdown entail for the Canadian economy and its currency? Joining me down the line to discuss is Andrew Grantham. Andrew, the Loonie dollar touched a two-week low against its US peer as a budget impasse in Canada's biggest trade partner persisted and another fight loomed over the US government's debt ceiling. This is bad news for growth in Canada, right?
It is, but probably not at this stage to the extent implied in the currency markets recently, with the Loonie, as we've seen, being the weakest performing major over the past week. The US government is not a major importer, not only of Canadian goods, but of goods from around the globe, really. And so a partial shutdown from the government in the US will only at the moment shave a tick or so off Q4 GDP in Canada. Now, the real impact will be if the US fails to raise the debt ceiling and has to cut back on other spending, which would have a broader impact on US demand. In that, under those circumstances, Canada will suffer a far greater hit from the US political situation. But at the moment, it's probably only going to take a tick or two off GDP.
The Bank of Canada had been deemed one of the more hawkish central banks, but at the same time they ran scared or saw sense that jumping the gun on raising rates could prove costly for the Canadian economy, particularly at these uncertain times. Where should policy go from here, do you think?
Well, it's true that earlier in the year, the Bank of Canada was seemingly threatening to raise rates, but that threat has now been watered down to such an extent that, it's obvious that they themselves believe that interest rates will be on hold for quite a prolonged period. Based on their forecast, the Bank of Canada themselves probably think that they'll be raising rates sometimes towards the end of 2014. We have a slightly weaker growth outlook for 2014 than they do, so we think the first hike could be early 2015 if growth comes in line with our forecast. So, they are going to be on hold for a prolonged period. They think that themselves, and we agree. We think first interest rate hike in Canada early 2015.
Canada's trade deficit widened more than expected in August as imports soared to a record high, suggesting that the Canadian economy is still waiting for that growth rotation into exports. But how damaging could this waiting game be for Canada?
Well, it could be damaging, and we have our forecast for 2014 is for 2.3% growth, but over half of that we expect to come from net trade and business investment related in particularly to the resource sector if we get slightly higher commodity prices. So if that rotation is delayed, we could be looking at a softer pace of growth, particularly given that the positive impacts that we've seen in terms of consumer spending and residential construction, which have really been driven by low interest rates, seem to be easing off now. So yeah, it is a big risk for Canadian growth. We still see the US economy in particular and the global economy stronger next year, which will help Canadian exports. But unless we start to see some signs of that in the next 3 to 6 months, then we could be looking at a slight disappointment for 2014.
Canada's benchmark 10-year government bond declined for the first time in 4 weeks, pushing yields on the benchmark security up 2 basis points. Can yields recover from here, and what is your outlook for the Loonie dollar?
Well, with the Bank of Canada on the sidelines now, Canadian yields have moved very closely, really, with Fed policy and speculation over tapering of QE over in the US. Now, given the political situation there, Fed tapering has really been delayed and could even be delayed into early 2014 now. So that could be when the yields start to recover. For the Canadian dollar, we do still see it a little weaker on a 3-month time horizon, with USD CAD rising to around 106. And that's based on the assumption that we do think Fed tapering will come back on the agenda within the next 3 months, and that will give the US dollar a slight boost. But then after that, we see the positive impact of a stronger US economy in 2014, supporting exports from Canada, and that should see the Loonie strengthening back again, ending 2014 somewhere near parity against the US dollar.
Andrew, lovely to speak to you. Thank you very much. Viewers, thank you for watching, and for those of you tuning in from Canada, happy Thanksgiving weekend. Goodbye for now.